The town lay in a quiet corner of the country, surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests. On most days it was a peaceful place, the kind of town where everyone knew each other's names and children played freely in the streets. But over the past few weeks, that peace had begun to crack. Whispers of danger had started circulating, and though nobody could say exactly what was coming, everyone felt it in the air. People walked a little faster, glanced over their shoulders a little more often, and closed their doors tighter at night. The sun still rose in the mornings, painting the town in soft gold, but even that light felt tense and uneasy, as though it was aware of the fear hanging over the streets. Families tried to go about their normal routines, but it was impossible. Shops that had once opened their doors with cheerful greetings now had windows shuttered, locks fastened, and signs that read, "Closed until further notice." Children were no longer laughing outside. They stayed inside, peering out of curtains at the empty streets. Even the dogs seemed to sense the change, their barks sharper, their movements more anxious. Those who ventured outdoors moved quickly, not lingering to enjoy the day, eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if waiting for something to appear at the center of town. The main square, which used to be bustling with activity, was eerily still. The fountain, which usually gurgled with sparkling water, was dry, and the benches were empty. A lone newspaper fluttered across the cobblestones, carried by the wind like a warning. Some of the older residents gathered in small groups, exchanging worried glances. They had lived through storms, fires, and other hardships, but nothing like this had ever shaken their sense of security. "No one will come," one of them muttered, a bitter edge in his voice. Others nodded silently, feeling the same hopelessness settle in their hearts. Among the worried residents were a few who refused to give in to fear. They were ordinary people, shopkeepers, teachers, farmers who had no special training or extraordinary skills. Yet, despite their uncertainty, they felt a strange determination growing within them. They began meeting in secret, gathering whatever resources they could find, and making plans to protect their neighbors. They knew they could not rely on help coming from outside, because messages sent for assistance had gone unanswered. Every phone call, every radio transmission seemed to disappear into nothingness. The world beyond the town felt distant, disconnected, and indifferent. These few brave souls became the heart of the town's resistance. They scoured basements for old supplies, flashlights, canned food, blankets, first aid kits. They reinforced doors and windows, setting up barricades with whatever furniture they could move. Each nail hammered and each board placed brought a small sense of control in a world that felt increasingly chaotic. The rest of the townspeople, while frightened, slowly began to follow their lead. Fear remained, but it was now accompanied by a glimmer of hope. The thought that maybe they could hold on until someone came. Even as they prepared, the threat loomed closer. Strange shadows appeared in the forest at night, movements too quick to be human. Odd noises echoed through the streets, unsettling the children and making adults tense. Some dismissed them as tricks of the imagination, while others whispered about what might be out there. The uncertainty made the days longer and the nights unbearable. Sleep was hard to come by. Parents stayed awake, listening for the slightest sound, clutching their children close, whispering reassurances they did not entirely believe themselves. Conversations in the town became dominated by speculation. "Do you think it will reach us?" people asked in hushed tones. "Will anyone come to help?" They spoke as if saying the words out loud might make the threat real, and yet not speaking was equally unbearable. Every face bore the weight of worry, but behind the fear, there was also courage, a stubborn refusal to give in completely. Even the young ones, though frightened, began learning to help. They carried supplies, held doors, and ran errands under the watchful eyes of their parents. In a strange way, the crisis brought the town closer together. Strangers helped each other, sharing food, water, and advice. Bonds were formed not by choice but by necessity, a testament to human resilience in the face of uncertainty. The nights were the hardest. Darkness seemed to amplify every fear, every sound, every shadow. Windows rattled in the wind, and the trees whispered ominously as branches scraped against walls. The few brave adults patrolled the streets at night, making sure everyone was safe and ready. They moved quietly, alert to every movement, every rustle, and every distant noise that might signal danger. Their hearts pounded with fear, but they pushed forward because they knew the town depended on them. They were not heroes in the traditional sense, no medals or special powers, but their courage mattered just as much as the days passed. Tension built steadily. The town waited for something, anything that would indicate they were not completely alone. Small signs of hope were treasured. A bird returning to a tree, a neighbor sharing extra food, a child's laugh breaking through the tension each moment reminded them of life beyond fear. And yet, the central question remained, would anyone come? Was there a force beyond their town that could help them, or were they truly abandoned? Amid all this uncertainty, stories from the past resurfaced. Elders recounted tales of heroes who had appeared at the last moment to save towns from destruction. These stories, passed down through generations, became more than just history. They became a lifeline. Even those who had doubted began to imagine that perhaps help could arrive, that miracles could happen, and that courage could be contagious. For the first time in days, a few smiles flickered on tired faces, and people dared to hope that they might survive whatever was coming. The preparations continued relentlessly. Barricades were strengthened, food was rationed carefully, and everyone was assigned a role. Some were lookouts, others were medics, and a few kept communication lines open as best they could. Despite exhaustion and fear, no one gave up. Every act, no matter how small, became a symbol of resistance, a promise that they would fight to protect their home, their families, and their neighbors. Even as the town braced for the unknown, a quiet anticipation grew. They did not know what form the danger would take, nor when it would arrive, but they knew that they were ready to face it together. And in that readiness, in that gathering of ordinary people with extraordinary determination, the first seeds of hope were planted. They were small, fragile, and uncertain, but they existed. And sometimes, in the darkest moments, the smallest sparks are enough to light a path toward survival. Every day blended into the next, each moment stretching long with tension. Children learned to stay calm, adults learned to mask fear with determination, and the town became a community bound not just by geography, but by shared courage. The calm before the storm was anything but peaceful. It was a tense, electric period in which lives were being reshaped, values tested, and courage forged. And though no one could see it yet, the moment of reckoning was approaching. Something, or someone, was coming, and when it arrived, the town would remember these days as the moments that defined them, that showed them what it truly meant to fight, hope, and survive. Days passed, and the town's uneasy calm began to shatter. The once quiet streets now echoed with strange noises that no one could explain. Small objects seemed to move on their own, and shadows appeared where there should have been none. Residents started noticing details that they had previously ignored: a distant flicker in the woods, a sudden gust of wind that seemed to rush purposefully through the empty streets, a low hum in the distance that made the hair on their arms stand on end. Fear settled deeper into their hearts, more tangible now than ever before. The town, which had been bracing itself with cautious optimism, now realized that the danger was not coming. It had already begun to arrive. The first incidents were subtle but unsettling. Power lines sparked without reason, leaving blocks in darkness at night. Radios and televisions emitted static that grew louder as night fell, as if trying to communicate something that no one could understand. People's pets acted strangely, barking at invisible shapes or refusing to go outside even when the sun was shining. Some dismissed these signs as coincidences or tricks of the mind, but as the days went on, the strange occurrences intensified. It became impossible to ignore the fact that something outside the town was acting in ways that defied explanation. In the mornings, the townspeople would gather to discuss what had happened overnight. Each story seemed more alarming than the last. One resident claimed that a tree in her backyard had suddenly split in two, though there was no wind. Another reported hearing footsteps outside her door at 3 in the morning, even though no one had been near her house. Small animals were found injured in unusual ways, as though something far larger and stronger than themselves had passed through. The sense of vulnerability in the town grew with each passing day, and whispers of fear turned into urgent conversations. "Is anyone out there?" people asked, their voices trembling. "Will help come, or are we truly alone?" The town's leaders worked tirelessly to maintain a sense of order, but their efforts were hampered by growing panic. Roads had become unsafe as debris fell from trees and streets, sometimes without warning. People who ventured out returned with stories of distant fires and strange lights in the horizon, adding to the uncertainty. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by anxiety and the lack of reliable information. No messages sent for help seemed to get through. Phone lines were disrupted, and emails and radio signals went unanswered. The townspeople started to feel a deep, creeping sense of isolation. It was as though the town had been cut off from the world, left alone to face whatever was approaching. Even in the midst of fear, some tried to remain practical. Families gathered supplies, checking food and water stocks, ensuring that every household had blankets, medical kits, and flashlights. The brave few who had prepared in Part 1 took the lead, organizing the town into small groups to handle different tasks. Some were tasked with patrolling the streets at night, watching for signs of danger. Others were assigned to check the surrounding forests and hills, searching for anything unusual. Children were instructed to stay close to adults, to observe and help in small ways, carrying supplies, delivering messages, and offering comfort. These efforts, while small, helped the town cling to some semblance of control amid the chaos. As days went on, more alarming signs appeared. Debris began to fall from the sky in small amounts, bits of metal, fragments of unknown material that startled those who saw them. At first, people thought they were just remnants of storms or accidents, but the debris did not match anything familiar. It was heavy, sharp, and seemed to land with deliberate force, scattering in patterns that could not be explained. Some brave townspeople attempted to retrieve the fragments to study them, but the sharpness and weight made it dangerous. The sense of menace grew, and fear shifted from abstract anxiety to tangible, immediate danger. The town was no longer merely waiting. It was under siege in subtle but relentless ways. The nights were the most terrifying. Shadows grew darker, noises louder, and the wind seemed to carry voices. Every creak of wood, every rustle of leaves, every distant howl or whisper could be interpreted as a sign of the looming threat. Children clung to their parents, trembling, and some refused to sleep at all, too frightened to close their eyes. Adults tried to mask their fear, but the tension was visible in their faces and in their movements. Even the bravest patrols returned with stories of strange lights in the distance, sudden tremors underfoot, and fleeting glimpses of figures too vast and large to be human. Sleep became rare, replaced by vigilance and preparation. Amid the fear and chaos, a faint glimmer of hope began to appear. In the darkest moments, some residents noticed unusual signs of distant light flickering in the horizon, or an echoing rumble that felt like more than natural phenomena. These hints, small and easily missed, suggested that something or someone was moving toward them. People began speculating about what it could be. Some imagined rescue forces, trained and ready, coming to save the town. Others hoped for an unknown miracle, a turning point that would arrive just when all seemed lost. The mere thought of help, however faint, was enough to give them courage. People's daily routines shifted to accommodate the growing tension. Parents taught their children how to respond to danger, how to move quietly and stay calm. Adults learned to ration supplies carefully, preparing for the possibility that they might need to survive for days without outside assistance. Even simple tasks, like fetching water or lighting a fire, became moments of vigilance and strategy. The town had become a community in crisis, each member relying on the other not just for comfort, but for survival. The fear was constant, but so was the determination to endure. The brave few who had prepared the town's defenses began noticing patterns in the strange occurrences. They observed the times when debris fell, when the winds shifted, when the shadows moved. Slowly, they started mapping these patterns, hoping to predict the next events. It was painstaking work, and the results were far from perfect, but it gave the town a small sense of control over an uncontrollable situation. Knowledge, even limited, became a weapon against fear. The residents who once felt helpless now had a reason to act, to strategize, and to hold on. Communication within the town grew stronger. People shared every observation, every sound, every movement, no matter how small. In basements, kitchens, and living rooms, residents compared notes and pieced together what they could. What had started as whispers became organized discussions. Fear no longer dominated every conversation. It was balanced by planning, analysis, and hope. The town, isolated though it was, began to feel united. Each person, each family, each child, had a role in the survival of the whole. Despite these efforts, the sense of urgency intensified. It was no longer enough to prepare. Action was needed. The town's leaders held emergency meetings to determine the best course forward. Plans were made for evacuation if necessary, for self-defense if attacked, and for sustaining life during long periods of isolation. These plans, though imperfect, created a shared focus, a collective purpose that steadied the residents' nerves. They realized that waiting passively would only increase the risk of disaster. Every hour, every day, demanded awareness, preparation, and courage. As the tension grew, the environment itself seemed to respond. The skies often darkened suddenly, even in the middle of the day. Storms arrived without warning, lashing rooftops and streets. Lightning struck in unusual patterns, sometimes targeting areas already weakened. Animals fled the forests and hills, their panic adding to the town's unease. And always, there were sounds in the distance, low rumbles, crackling noises, and fleeting flashes of light that no one could explain. The town, already on edge, found that their fear had tangible evidence in the world around them. Even with these terrifying signs, the town's spirit was not broken. Small acts of courage became powerful symbols of resistance. A teenager who ran errands through dangerous streets became a hero in the eyes of neighbors. A mother who comforted frightened children while reinforcing their home walls inspired others to keep going. Every gesture, every act of bravery reminded the town that they were not completely helpless. Though they did not know who or what might come to help them, they had each other, and they had their determination to survive. And then, as if the tension could grow no further, the first distant sign of something beyond human understanding appeared. A low rumble, so faint that some thought it was their imagination, vibrated through the town. Trees shivered as though caught in a powerful wind, though the air was calm. Windows rattled, and a strange light flickered over the hills. People paused, frozen, their eyes searching the horizon. Was it the end of the terror, or the beginning of something even more extraordinary? Fear and hope mingled in equal measure, creating a strange electric feeling in the air. The town waited, holding its collective breath. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of light was watched, studied, and feared. Parents held children close, neighbors watched each other's backs, and the brave few continued their patrols and preparations. Time seemed to stretch, the hours long and heavy, but the residents endured. They had survived so much already, enough to know that endurance, patience, and courage were their strongest tools. And in that waiting, that tense anticipation, the town's resilience grew. They had seen the signs of danger, felt the fear, and yet continued to prepare and protect each other. They were no longer just a group of frightened residents. They were a community united by adversity, bound together by shared experience and mutual determination. Though they did not yet know the nature of the force approaching, they were ready to face it, and that readiness, fragile though it was, would soon be tested in ways they could never have imagined. The days grew longer with tension, and the nights felt endless. The town had been living under a shadow of fear for weeks, and the people had begun to feel the weight of constant vigilance pressing down on their shoulders. Every sound was analyzed, every movement scrutinized, and every shadow suspected of harboring unseen threats. The brave few who had taken on leadership roles moved tirelessly through the streets, checking barricades, inspecting supplies, and comforting frightened families. Though exhausted, they knew that giving up was not an option. Their community depended on them, and even a small lapse could have disastrous consequences. As the days wore on, the strange occurrences that had once been occasional became more frequent and harder to ignore. Objects in homes would shift positions overnight, sometimes in ways that defied logic. Windows that had been securely locked were found slightly ajar, as if something had tested them. Shadows flitted across rooms, vanishing when someone tried to focus on them. Even the forest seemed alive with movement. The townspeople began to notice lights in the distance, not stars, not ordinary reflections, but small, sharp glimmers that darted unpredictably. Some said the lights were signaling something. Others feared it was a prelude to disaster. No one could be certain. The uncertainty weighed heavily on the children. Their laughter had mostly disappeared, replaced by whispered conversations and wide-eyed vigilance. Parents struggled to keep their children calm, often repeating instructions about safety and staying together. Night after night, children huddled under blankets, sometimes falling asleep to the sound of distant rumblings that seemed to vibrate through the entire town. Adults did their best to mask their anxiety, but it was impossible to hide the fear entirely. Even the most experienced residents, who had faced storms, fires, and accidents before, found themselves trembling at the strange, unnatural patterns emerging around them. Despite the fear, a subtle shift began to take place. Some residents noticed patterns in the chaos. They began tracking the strange lights, the falling debris, and the low rumbles that traveled through the earth. Slowly, the town started to map these events, piecing together clues that could help them anticipate what might come next. Though these efforts were far from perfect, they provided a sense of agency in a situation that otherwise felt uncontrollable. People who had once felt powerless now had small, tangible roles to play in protecting their community. As hope began to flicker, the town's leaders intensified their preparations. Barricades were reinforced, escape routes planned, and supply caches strategically placed throughout the town. Everyone had a role, no matter how small. Children were taught to remain calm under pressure, to hide if necessary, and to follow instructions without hesitation. Adults took turns patrolling the streets, keeping watch for any sign of the unknown threat. Even the elderly, whose strength was diminished, contributed by sharing knowledge of the town's terrain, its hidden paths, and secret spaces that could provide shelter. The town, though small and isolated, was becoming a well-coordinated unit, ready for whatever might arrive, but the tension continued to build. One morning, a series of strange events shook the town more than ever before. Windows rattled violently without wind. Strange vibrations traveled through the ground, and lights flickered and dimmed as if a massive presence was moving nearby. Residents ran to the streets to see what was happening, but there was nothing visible. The forest stood still, the hills remained silent, and yet the sensation of movement persisted. Panic began to creep back into hearts that had been finding courage. Some whispered that the worst was about to come, that the unknown force was not testing them anymore, it was ready to strike. Fear and hope became entwined. The townspeople were terrified, yet there was an unmistakable stir of anticipation. Those who had been preparing for weeks, patrolling streets and reinforcing homes, we began to recognize a sound that others might have ignored, a low, distant rumble that grew steadily, almost imperceptibly at first, then louder, shaking the windows and rattling doors. The sound seemed alive, purposeful, as if announcing the arrival of something massive, something powerful. Hearts pounded in chests, and some residents felt a mixture of dread and excitement. Dread for what was coming. Excitement because it meant the arrival of help they had longed for. The first glimpse of the approaching force came unexpectedly. It was not visible in the sky at first. Only the ground seemed to tremble beneath its movement. Streetlights flickered as if acknowledging the presence. Trees swayed violently, yet the wind remained calm. Animals ran in all directions, sensing a force too large and powerful to be human. The town froze, every person holding their breath, staring toward the horizon. The sound grew louder, deeper, more resonant, and it became clear that whatever was coming was immense and unstoppable. Fear gripped them again, stronger than before, but alongside it, hope began to burn brighter. The impossible seemed possible. The people who had been organizing the town's defenses realized this was the moment they had been waiting for. Patrols returned, whispering urgently to neighbors, "Something is coming. Be ready." Families gathered together, children were held close, and everyone moved toward the safest parts of their homes. Hearts raced, palms sweated, but the town had learned resilience. Fear, though intense, was tempered with preparation. Every person played a role, and even small acts like closing a window or reinforcing a door felt like critical contributions to survival. Then came the first sight of the unknown force in motion. From the hills, shimmering lights appeared, moving with precision and speed. They were accompanied by sounds that were neither mechanical nor natural. A low hum that resonated deep in the chest and vibrated through the earth. Some residents whispered prayers, others gasped in disbelief, and a few stepped forward to observe more closely, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity. The lights approached steadily, coordinated and purposeful, yet graceful, as if every movement had been planned. It was unlike anything the town had ever seen. The force began to affect the environment directly. Debris that had once fallen unpredictably now seemed drawn toward it. Shadows shifted unnaturally, bending and moving as the lights advanced. Even the weather seemed to respond, clouds forming in strange shapes, the air charged with static energy. Some residents, overwhelmed, fell to their knees, shielding their eyes from the growing brilliance. Others stood frozen, captivated, unable to look away. It was both terrifying and awe-inspiring, a sight that would be etched into their memories forever. As the approach continued, a strange calm settled over the town. The residents realized they were witnessing a turning point. Whatever had been testing them, terrifying them, and shaking their world for weeks was now revealing itself. And while fear remained, there was also the undeniable knowledge that help true, formidable, and extraordinary was finally arriving. The town had waited so long, prepared so diligently, and now the moment of reckoning had come. Even those who had doubted the possibility of rescue felt a spark of hope. They could feel the presence of the approaching force, not just in sight and sound, but in the air itself. It was a tangible reassurance, a confirmation that they were not abandoned, that they had not struggled and prepared in vain. Families clung to one another, silently acknowledging that survival was now within reach, though it would still require courage and vigilance. As the lights drew closer, the town's leaders directed everyone to their pre-planned positions. Families were instructed to stay together, patrols prepared to guide anyone in danger, and those with medical knowledge readied themselves for injuries or shock. Children were hushed and guided to safe locations, while adults kept watch, observing the movement of the approaching force. It was a delicate balance between anticipation and fear, a tension so intense that every heartbeat seemed amplified. The rumbling grew louder, almost like a heartbeat for the entire town, synchronized with the rising energy of the approaching force. Windows rattled violently, doors shook, and even the ground seemed to pulse. The residents gripped whatever they could, holding on for stability as much as for reassurance. The moment had finally arrived when the town would no longer be passive. Observers of their own faith, they were about to witness action, and that action promised salvation. And yet, even in awe, the townspeople remained vigilant. They had learned that hope alone could not save them. Preparation, courage, and unity had carried them this far. As they watched, the lights descended closer to the town, moving with precision, illuminating every street, every corner, and every anxious face. The sound of their approach, deep and resonant, filled every space, drowning out fear with its sheer presence. It was a signal that the unknown, the unpredictable, and the terrifying had arrived, but not to harm them. Instead, it had come to restore order, to provide protection, and to shift the balance in the town's favor. The townspeople could hardly believe what they were seeing. The force was overwhelming in its scale and precision, yet there was something almost gentle in its intent. The initial terror transformed into cautious hope, and finally into awe. The weeks of fear, preparation, and uncertainty had led to this singular, breathtaking moment. The town had endured, prepared, and survived through the darkest days, and now they were on the cusp of witnessing a power greater than anything they could have imagined. And in that moment, the town understood that survival was no longer just a possibility, it was imminent. They had been tested, pushed to the brink, and forced to confront the unknown. Yet through courage, preparation, and unwavering hope, they had reached a turning point. The force approaching was no longer distant or abstract. It was tangible, powerful, and undeniably real. The town's collective heartbeat quickened as they braced for what was about to unfold. The rumble had been growing for hours, shaking the earth beneath the town and echoing through the hills. At first it had been distant, a faint vibration that could almost be ignored. But now, it was impossible to ignore. Windows rattled violently, doors shook on their hinges, and even the strongest structures quivered under the force. The townspeople gathered outside, straining their eyes toward the horizon, hearts pounding in unison. What they had been waiting for, the arrival of help, was finally here, and its presence was more immense than anyone could have imagined. At first it was just lights, brilliant white, and powerful. They pierced the darkness in a way that felt almost holy. They moved with purpose, precise and deliberate, cutting across the hills and valleys, illuminating the town in stark relief. Shadows danced wildly in their wake, yet there was no chaos in the movement itself. It was as if every step, every shift, had been calculated down to the smallest detail. The townspeople watched in awe, their fear mingling with wonder, unsure whether to run or remain rooted in place. Some fell to their knees, unable to bear the sight, while others raised their heads, silently welcoming what they hoped would be salvation. Then the first of the machines appeared. They were enormous, far larger than anything the townspeople had seen, moving with a precision that defied understanding. Vehicles equipped with advanced technology rolled into the streets, their engines quiet but their presence undeniable. Armored units formed protective lines along key streets, ensuring that the town's vulnerable areas were immediately secured. It was not chaos that had arrived, but order, a force so powerful, coordinated, and efficient that it seemed almost otherworldly. The fear that had gripped the town for weeks began to give way to a sense of relief. For the first time, residents realized that they were no longer alone. The arrival of the force was not just about strength, however. The individuals within it moved with exceptional skill and courage, coordinating effortlessly as they assessed threats and secured areas. Teams of engineers, medics, and strategists worked side by side, each person aware of the role of the others, their actions synchronized to perfection. Residents who had spent days preparing for survival watched in disbelief as the professionals executed tasks they could not have imagined, dismantling hazards, stabilizing structures, and restoring order. The town had expected help, but what arrived exceeded their wildest expectations. The unknown debris that had fallen over the past days and weeks was immediately cleared. Teams moved swiftly, removing dangerous fragments and ensuring that streets and homes were safe. They worked silently, efficiently, and with purpose, moving with an intensity that left the townspeople in awe. Families who had been huddled inside their homes emerged cautiously, watching the activity with wide eyes. It was not just that the threat was being neutralized. It was that the townspeople now understood they were being protected by an unstoppable force, a presence that seemed to anticipate danger before it even arrived. As the machines and personnel moved through the town, the once dreaded noises transformed into reassurance. The low hums, vibrations, and distant rumbles that had terrified residents were now recognized as part of the operation, a sound of protection, not destruction. Residents began to relax slightly, though vigilance remained. Children peeked from behind curtains and doors, watching armored vehicles roll past and personnel coordinate with calm authority. Parents held their children tightly, whispering that the end of fear had finally come, even as they marveled at the scale and precision of the force. Surrounding them, the force was not just physical, it was tactical, intelligent, and adaptive. Advanced sensors detected hidden hazards, guiding teams to areas that required immediate attention. Communication was instantaneous, coordination flawless, and decision-making precise. The townspeople, who had felt helpless for weeks, now watched a spectacle of strategy and skill that seemed almost impossible. Each movement, each action, was calculated to ensure maximum safety with minimum disruption. The town's defenders, ordinary people who had worked tirelessly to protect their community, found themselves in awe of the extraordinary capabilities of the force. Now working alongside them, one of the most remarkable aspects of the force's arrival was the way it restored hope. Streets that had been empty and tense for days now hummed with activity. People began to emerge from their homes, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence. Neighbors who had once been isolated now shared stories, watched together, and helped coordinate small tasks. The town's cohesion, already strengthened through weeks of fear and preparation, reached a new level. Residents realized that they were not simply witnesses to a display of power, they were participants in a coordinated effort to save their community. The force's approach was meticulous. Key locations were secured first. Schools, hospitals, and community centers received immediate attention to ensure that vulnerable populations were protected. Barricades that the townspeople had painstakingly built were reinforced, and supply caches were secured and expanded. Every corner, every street, and every building was considered, analyzed, and addressed. The town had feared for its survival, and now every resident could see that it had been taken seriously. The force's arrival was not just dramatic, it was effective, tangible, and life-saving. As the hours passed, the townspeople began to understand the scale of what they were witnessing. The force's vehicles and equipment were unlike anything they had seen before, combining technology and expertise in ways that seemed almost beyond imagination. Teams moved with speed and efficiency, carrying out tasks that would have taken weeks for ordinary people. Streets that had been dangerous and empty now became organized and secure. Hazards were neutralized, debris cleared, and damaged infrastructure stabilized. The town's fear, though still present, began to shift into gratitude and admiration. The impact of the force extended beyond the immediate protection of the town. Medics treated those who had been injured or sick, providing care that exceeded what the local facilities could offer. Engineers repaired damaged infrastructure, restoring electricity, water, and communication lines that had been compromised. The townspeople watched in awe as their community was transformed. Slowly but surely, from a place of fear into a place of safety and order. It was a visible, tangible reminder that help had truly arrived, and that their efforts and preparation had not been in vain. Even in the midst of this extraordinary operation, the force remained calm and methodical. There was no panic, no wasted effort, only precision and purpose. Residents who had once doubted that anyone would come now found themselves inspired. Families began to emerge fully from their homes. Children laughed cautiously again. And the streets, once empty and tense, were now alive with movement and relief. It was a remarkable transformation, one that underscored the power of courage, preparation, and extraordinary intervention. The townspeople began to realize that the force was more than a group of machines and people. It was a symbol of hope, of resilience, and of the possibility that even the direst circumstances could be overcome. Weeks of fear, uncertainty, and preparation had led to this moment. They had been tested, pushed to their limits, and forced to confront the unknown. And now, thanks to the arrival of the force, they could see a path forward, a chance to survive, to recover, and to rebuild. The force continued its operations through the day and into the night. Every threat was neutralized, every hazard addressed, and every resident assisted. The once frightened town had become a hub of coordinated activity, guided by the precision and skill of the force that had arrived seemingly out of nowhere. Even those who had been skeptical of rescue found themselves inspired, humbled, and grateful. The arrival was not just an event, it was a turning point, a demonstration of courage, skill, and power that would be remembered for generations. As the night fell, the force completed its initial objectives. Streets were secure, homes were protected, and the town's residents could finally rest with a sense of safety. Families huddled together, children slept peacefully, and even the bravest patrols allowed themselves to breathe. The threat that had loomed for weeks had been confronted head-on, neutralized by the extraordinary intervention of a force unlike any they had imagined. The town, once paralyzed by fear, had survived, and in surviving, the residents had learned something invaluable about courage, resilience, and the power of hope. Even as calm returned, the townspeople could not help but marvel at what they had witnessed. The force had arrived precisely when it was needed, acting with skill, precision, and strength that had surpassed every expectation. The once isolated town was no longer alone, and the presence of the force left a lasting impression on every resident. They understood that their preparation, courage, and unity had made the difference in how effectively the force could act. Their struggle had not been in vain. It had prepared them to survive, to cooperate, and to witness a moment of extraordinary intervention. By the end of the night, the town was transformed. Fear remained, as it always would, but it was tempered by gratitude, awe, and renewed confidence. The residents had been saved not just by the arrival of an external force, but by their own courage, preparation, and determination. They had faced weeks of terror, uncertainty, and isolation, and emerged not only alive but strengthened. The streets were alive with life once more, the buildings were secure, and the people, though weary, were filled with hope for the first time in weeks. The arrival of the force was not just a rescue, it was a lesson. It demonstrated that even in the face of overwhelming danger, courage, preparation, and unity could withstand the storm. The townspeople had survived through their own determination, and now, with extraordinary help, they had been saved. It was a moment that would be remembered forever, a turning point that marked the arrival of hope, protection, and the triumph of human skill and courage in the face of uncertainty. The morning after the arrival of the force brought a quiet that felt different from anything the town had known in weeks. It was no longer the tense silence of fear, but a calm born of safety and relief. Streets that had been empty, haunted by shadows and uncertainty, were now alive with movement. Residents emerged cautiously at first, stepping out of their homes to inspect the results of the night's extraordinary events. They walked carefully, eyes wide, taking in the reality that they had survived not by chance, but because help had arrived at exactly the right moment. The town had been transformed. Buildings that had once been damaged were now stabilized, debris cleared, and hazards neutralized. The streets, once tense and silent, now held a sense of security that seemed almost unbelievable. People paused in the streets, looking at neighbors they had not spoken to in weeks. Small greetings, hesitant at first, turned into warm smiles and shared laughter. The fear that had dominated the town's life now began to lift, replaced by a collective sense of relief and gratitude. Children played cautiously again, their laughter tentative at first, but growing louder with each passing hour. Parents watched with joy, feeling the weight of weeks of fear begin to lift from their shoulders. Families gathered in small groups, exchanging stories about the events of the past days, marveling at the precision and power of the force that had arrived. Each person had a tale to tell, how they had held their breath as the lights approached, how they had felt the vibrations in the earth, and how they had seen the incredible skill and coordination that had protected their town. Even those who had been skeptical or fearful during the weeks of preparation now spoke with awe about what they had witnessed. They marveled at the technology, the coordination, and the bravery of the people who had arrived to help. It was not just their strength that impressed the townspeople, but their calm, methodical approach to every problem. Hazards were removed carefully, streets secured, and families protected without a single unnecessary risk. It was clear that nothing had been left to chance. The townspeople realized that their preparations had been critical as well. Without their vigilance and courage, The force could not have operated as effectively. It was a shared victory, born from cooperation between the residents and the extraordinary force that had intervened. As the day progressed, the force began to organize the town for recovery. Teams of engineers repaired damaged buildings, restored power lines, and cleared remaining debris. Streets that had been blocked by fallen trees or scattered fragments were reopened, and communication lines were restored. Medics treated injuries, both small and serious, and offered care for those who had been suffering from fear and stress as much as from physical harm. The townspeople watched with amazement as their environment, once chaotic and dangerous, became orderly and safe. They began to understand that survival was not just about enduring. Fear, it was also about rebuilding, and the force had arrived not only to protect, but to restore. Amid this transformation, the townspeople began to reflect on what had happened. Weeks of anxiety, preparation, and constant vigilance had tested them in ways they could never have imagined. They had lived in fear, uncertain whether anyone would ever come to help them, and now, that fear had been replaced with gratitude and awe. They realized that the courage they had shown reinforcing doors, keeping watch, preparing supplies, and staying united, had been critical in ensuring that the town was ready when help arrived. The ordinary people of the town had proven themselves extraordinary through resilience, preparation, and unity. Children, who had spent weeks hiding from imagined dangers, began to explore the streets cautiously. They inspected the repaired areas with curiosity, their eyes wide with wonder at the vehicles, lights, and equipment that had appeared so suddenly. They asked questions of the adults and of the personnel from the force, eager to understand everything they could about what had happened. Parents answered patiently, explaining the events as best they could, and reassuring their children that the danger had passed. Laughter began to return, tentative at first, then growing stronger as the day went on. The sound of children playing was a small but powerful symbol that life was returning to the town. The adults too found themselves reconnecting with neighbors in ways that had not happened for weeks. People who had once been isolated or fearful now worked together to clean streets, check on vulnerable neighbors, and ensure that everyone had what they needed. The community, tested to its limits by fear and uncertainty, was now stronger, united not only by shared survival but by shared gratitude. Bonds were formed and strengthened in these moments, as neighbors helped each other recover from both the practical and emotional impacts of the crisis. They realized that their unity, courage, and care for one another had been as essential to survival as the force that had arrived. The personnel from the force worked tirelessly, but even they allowed moments of pause to interact with the townspeople. They explained aspects of their operations, guided families in securing their homes for the future, and provided reassurance that the town was now safe. Their presence was both protective and educational, offering the residents insight into how preparedness, coordination, and courage could meet even the most extraordinary challenges. The townspeople listened carefully, asking questions, and absorbing lessons that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The experience was humbling, inspiring, and empowering all at once. By mid-afternoon, the town had been stabilized. Streets were cleared, debris removed, and buildings made safe. The townspeople could finally move through their environment without fear, and a sense of normalcy began to return. Families gathered in homes and yards, sharing food and stories. Children ran freely through the streets again, their laughter filling the air and signaling that life had returned. The quiet dread that had dominated the town for weeks was replaced by an energy of hope, relief, and joy. People looked at one another with renewed appreciation, realizing that survival had been a shared effort and that their community had emerged stronger for it. As evening approached, a sense of reflection settled over the town. Residents paused to consider what they had endured, what they had learned, and what they had accomplished. They thought about the fear, the preparation, and the weeks of uncertainty, and they thought about the extraordinary force that had arrived, transforming what could have been a catastrophe into a story of survival and triumph. Gratitude filled their hearts not only for the power and skill that had protected them, but for the courage they had discovered in themselves and in one another. The experience had left a mark on every person, a reminder of resilience, hope, and the extraordinary potential of unity in the face of danger. As night fell, the town was calm for the first time in weeks. Lights shone brightly in homes, streets were safe and clear, and families gathered together in peace. The personnel from the force completed their final assessments and ensured that all hazards had been addressed. They communicated to the townspeople that their presence was no longer needed in the immediate sense, that the town was now secure and capable of maintaining safety on its own. Residents watched them leave with a mixture of awe and gratitude, understanding that the extraordinary arrival had not just saved lives, but had restored their sense of security and possibility. In the days that followed, the town began to recover fully. Families repaired minor damages, shared supplies, and helped each other rebuild. Shops reopened, schools resumed classes, and life returned to a rhythm that had been interrupted by fear and uncertainty. The lessons of the crisis remained vivid. Vigilance, preparation, courage, and unity were the foundations of survival. But townspeople carried these lessons forward. ensuring that they would be ready for future challenges, no matter how unexpected or extraordinary. The experience also left the town with stories to pass down. Children would grow up hearing about the weeks of fear and the miraculous arrival of the force that had saved them. Adults would tell tales of bravery, preparation, and cooperation that had allowed the town to endure. These stories would become part of the community's identity, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, courage and hope could prevail. The town had been tested and had survived, and the lessons learned would guide generations to come. Gratitude became a central feeling in the community. People thanked one another for their support, acknowledged the bravery of neighbors, and reflected on the extraordinary intervention that had saved them. Families hugged tightly, neighbors shared meals, and children ran freely without fear. Even the quietest residents felt a renewed connection to the town and to one another. The events of the past weeks had transformed the community, not just physically, but emotionally and socially. They had learned the value of resilience, the importance of preparation, and the strength of unity. Ultimately, the town emerged stronger than before. The weeks of fear, preparation, and anticipation had tested every resident, and though the experience it had been terrifying, it had also revealed their inner strength. The extraordinary force that had arrived had been a catalyst, but it was the courage, determination, and unity of the townspeople that had allowed them to survive and rebuild. They understood that survival was never just about waiting for help. It was about preparing, acting, and supporting one another when the moment of crisis arrived. The town would never forget the events of those days, the fear, the anticipation, and the miraculous arrival of a force unlike anything they had ever imagined. It had been a test, a challenge, and ultimately a triumph. Families and neighbors had learned to rely on one another, to find courage in the face of fear, and to remain vigilant even when hope seemed distant. And in the end, they had survived, stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. Life returned to a rhythm that was familiar, yet forever changed. The streets, the homes, and the hearts of the townspeople carried the memory of the extraordinary days when they had feared for everything, only to be saved by a force that was greater than they could have imagined. The story of survival, courage, and hope would be told for generations. A testament to what can happen when ordinary people rise to extraordinary challenges and when help arrives just in time. The town had been tested, it had endured, and it had emerged victorious.